Is this some kind of joke? The guard's voice cut sharply through the quiet morning air, tinged with disdain. Arms crossed, he stood like a human barrier in his crisp dress uniform, blocking the main entrance to Arlington National Cemetery. Beside him, a younger man mirrored his stance, smirking with the arrogance of youth. In front of them stood John Miller. At 87, his posture was slightly stooped, hands worn by decades of hard work and his face mapped with the lines of a long life. He wore a simple dark suit worn at the cuffs but spotless. It was the only one he owned. Despite the guard's tone, Miller did not flinch. His gaze remained steady on the green hills beyond the gate, where flags fluttered at half-mast. He said nothing, letting silence speak against the guard's aggression. The younger guard stepped forward, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. "Sir, this is a private funeral for General Wallace. Invitation only. I need to see your credentials or you'll have to leave." The tension hung heavy, an out-of-place note in a place meant for honor. The guard enforced rules, seeing only an elderly man seemingly in the wrong place. He could not recognize the history standing before him, a living reminder of the very values the cemetery commemorated. The atmosphere tightened as more vehicles arrived. Long black sedans with government plates, their passengers throwing curious, pitying looks at the old man held at the gate. John Miller remained still. He had faced worse before. The younger guard, name tag reading Jennings, let out a dramatic sigh. Impatience edged his tone. "Look, Grandpa, I don't have time for this. The motorcade will be here any minute. You're creating a security problem." He gestured vaguely down the road. "If you want to visit a grave, the public entrance is a mile that way. Are you going to move along or do we have to make you?" John's reply was quiet, yet carried unexpected weight, like stones smoothed by a river. "I'm here for the general. He would have wanted me here." The second guard, Corporal Davis, let out a short, humorless laugh. "Right, you and the general, best friends, I'm sure, sir. With all due respect, General Wallace was a 4-star. He advised presidents. He didn't have time for people without an invitation." The insult was clear, though wrapped in a thin layer of formal address. A small crowd had begun to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by the standoff. High-ranking military officers, serious-faced politicians, and mourning family members, all dressed in formal black, whispered quietly among themselves. Their murmurs formed a low hum beneath the guard's sharp commands. John could feel their eyes on him, pity, annoyance, and embarrassment. It was familiar. A lifetime of being underestimated and overlooked had made him accustomed to invisibility. Usually he accepted it. Not today. Not here. "My name is John Miller," he said evenly. "Just tell them John Miller is here." Jennings stepped closer, deliberately invading his space, an intimidating presence. "John Miller. Okay, and I'm the Secretary of Defense. Names mean nothing without the right paperwork, old-timer." He jabbed a gloved finger at John's chest. "No medals on your suit, no ribbons, no proof of service. As far as I'm concerned, you're a civilian trespassing on federal property during a restricted event." The accusation hung in the air. "No proof of service." His hand drifted almost automatically to his side, sensing the phantom weight of burdens long since laid down. Evidence of his past existed, not the kind that could be polished or displayed, but inscribed in his bones, etched into memory. A junior officer, a crisp second lieutenant with a face too young for the rank, approached from a nearby checkpoint. Drawn by the disturbance, "What's the holdup, Corporal?" he asked. "This man, sir," Davis replied, indicating John, "refuses to leave. He claims to be a friend of General Wallace. No invitation, no credentials." The lieutenant scanned John, noting the worn fabric of his suit and scuffed shoes. His judgment was swift, dismissive. "Sir, you are interrupting a state funeral. I am ordering you one last time to leave immediately." The tone was practiced, rehearsed in mirrors, an effort to convey authority not yet earned. John's patience, deep and enduring, was nearing its limit. "I'm not leaving," he said simply, absolutely. The lieutenant's expression hardened. "Then you are under arrest for trespassing and disrupting a military ceremony." He signaled to the guards. "Escort him out. If he resists, handcuff him." As Jennings and Davis moved toward John, the lieutenant's gaze caught something on the old man's lapel, a small, dull metal pin, no larger than a dime, crookedly attached. It was tarnished, misshapen, seemingly worthless. The lieutenant smirked and flicked it with his finger. "What's this supposed to be? Some prize from a Cracker Jack box?" The instant his finger touched the metal, reality shifted. The manicured lawns of Arlington dissolved, replaced by a mud-slick jungle under relentless rain. Halfway across the world, the fresh scent of cut grass gave way to the metallic tang of blood and cordite. The subdued sobs of mourners transformed into the urgent screams of wounded men. A young captain, his face streaked with dirt and fear, lay trapped beneath a fallen banyan tree, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. That captain was David Wallace. He struggled to hand a jagged, still-warm piece of metal to a young John Miller. His bloodied hands shook as he spoke. "Keep this, John," Wallace rasped, his voice strained with pain. "It's not official, not regulation, but it means more than anything they could ever mint. It shows you were there. It shows you saved us." The vision broke. John was back at the gate, the sun glaring in his eyes. The lieutenant smirked, unaware of the change in John's expression. A small spark, long buried, now burned in John's eyes. He gently pushed the lieutenant's hand away from the pin. "Don't touch that," he said, his voice low and firm. Tension had reached its peak. Encouraged by their officer, the guard seized John's frail arms. The small crowd gasped. The humiliation was complete, a public shaming of a man whose only desire was to bid farewell to a friend. But not everyone was passive. Near the back, a young army captain named Hayes watched, unease growing with every second. Having served 2 overseas tours, he recognized the calm, unshakable presence of a true combat veteran. It was in the way John stood, unflinching against insults, his gaze cutting through the surrounding chaos. Something was deeply wrong. When the guards touched John, Captain Hayes knew he couldn't stand idly by. Direct action was impossible. It would spark insubordination charges and jurisdictional conflict. But he could make a call. Discreetly, he pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb moving quickly across the screen. He dialed a direct line to a man who had been General Wallace's right hand for 20 years, Colonel Markinson. Turning his back to the crowd to shield the conversation, he spoke urgently. "Sir, it's Captain Hayes," he said quietly. On the other end, the colonel's voice was tense, distracted. "Hayes, what is it?" "We're 5 minutes from the procession." "Is there an issue with the honor guard?" "No, sir. It's at the main gate. There's an incident. Security is detaining an elderly man trying to enter." Markinson exhaled, audible even over the line. "This requires my attention. Why?" "Let security handle it. They have orders." "He says he knew the general." "His name is John Miller," Hayes explained, then added the detail that had been nagging him. "Sir, he's wearing a small tarnished pin on his lapel. It's misshapen. Looks like a piece of shrapnel." There was a sudden heavy silence on the other end, the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. The ambient noise of the command post, the radio chatter, the shuffling papers, faded into the background. Captain Hayes held his breath. When the colonel spoke again, his tone had shifted completely. The irritation was gone, replaced by an urgent intensity that made the hair on Hayes's neck stand on end. "Captain, what did you say his name was?" "Miller, sir." "John Miller." The line went dead. Hayes looked up just in time to see the guards beginning to drag the old man from the gate toward a waiting security vehicle. He was too late. Inside a command tent 100 yards from the ceremony, Colonel Markinson stared at his phone as if it had shocked him. He slammed it onto the table, his face pale. An aide, a young major, looked up, startled. "Sir, is everything all right?" "Get me General Peters," Markinson barked, his voice low and urgent. "On the radio now, get him off the reviewing stand." "I don't care how." He began pacing the tent like a caged tiger, running a hand through his hair as his mind raced. John Miller. After all these years, General Wallace had spent the last decade trying to find him to express his gratitude one final time. In his final letter, Wallace had left explicit instructions, now held in Markinson's desk. "If a man named John Miller ever comes looking for me," it read, "give him whatever he asks. He is owed a debt this nation can never repay." The major returned with a radio handset. "I have General Peters, sir." Markinson snatched it. "General, this is Markinson. We have a code shepherd at the main gate. I repeat, code shepherd is active," the radio crackled. The voice of 4-star General Michael Peters came through, stripped of all ceremony. "Say again, Colonel Shepard?" "That's not possible." "It is him, sir. Description matches. The pin, the name, John Miller. Security is moving to arrest him." The response was immediate and decisive. "Halt everything. Halt the procession. I'm on my way." Back at the gate, the young lieutenant allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had restored order, removed the disruption. Leaning against the stone pillar, he watched as his men handled the old veteran. Then he moved in for a final act, aiming to crush what little dignity remained. He approached John, who stood between the two guards. His shoulders were slumped, not in defeat, but in quiet, profound sorrow. The lieutenant got close, his voice condescending. "Last chance, old man. Walk away now, with what's left of your pride, or spend the rest of General Wallace's funeral in a holding cell. We'll press charges, and I'll personally recommend a full psychiatric evaluation. At your age, with your delusions, you're a danger to yourself and a public embarrassment." He sneered. "Want to pay your respects? Fine. You can do it from behind bars while you try to remember your own name." This was his overreach, the final unforgivable act of arrogance. He had pushed a man of honor too far. The breaking point of humiliation had been reached, and in that moment a line was crossed from which there was no return. It began as a low rumble, a vibration more felt in the chest than heard by the ears. The sound was entirely out of place in the solemn quiet of Arlington, and every head turned, including the lieutenant's. Over the hill came a motorcade of 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans, their tinted windows catching the morning sun like dark mirrors. They didn't move with the slow, measured pace of the funeral procession. Instead, they advanced with the urgency and precision of a rapid response team. Tires screeched on gravel as the vehicles came to an abrupt stop just feet from the gate. The lieutenant and his guards froze, their hands still resting on John Miller. Doors opened with military precision. Out stepped not military police, but 6 men in immaculate army dress blues. They were sergeants and colonels, their chests heavy with ribbons and medals that clinked softly with every movement. Colonel Markinson was first, his face set in a mask of cold fury. Then the rear door of the lead vehicle opened, and General Michael Peters stepped out. Tall and imposing, 4 silver stars gleamed on each shoulder. The very air seemed to weigh down. The sounds of the cemetery, the wind in the trees, distant traffic, whispered murmurs, fell silent. All attention was drawn to the 4-star general, whose presence seemed to drain the oxygen from the space. The lieutenant felt a wave of dread. Instinctively, he and his men snapped to attention, their hands lifting from John Miller as if he were radioactive. General Peters didn't glance at the lieutenant or his guards. His storm cloud-colored eyes scanned the scene until they rested on the stooped figure of John Miller. In that instant, his demeanor shifted. The commanding rigidity melted, replaced by a look of deep, almost reverential respect. General Peters began to walk, each polished boot striking the pavement in a slow, deliberate rhythm. He passed the terrified lieutenant, the stunned guards, everyone, heading for one man alone. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of John Miller. In the absolute silence, the general drew himself to full height, back straight, and raised his right hand in a salute. Not a casual gesture, but the sharpest, most precise salute the lieutenant had ever seen. A gesture of ultimate respect from a 4-star general to a civilian in a worn suit. Then, his voice firm and commanding enough to address armies and advise presidents, carried across the grounds, "Mr. Miller, it is an honor, sir." The lieutenant, utterly bewildered, finally found his voice. Stammering, "General, sir, I apologies for the disruption." This man was causing a scene. He had no authorization to be here. General Peters' gaze snapped toward the lieutenant. He didn't lower his salute, but his eyes pierced the young officer with a force that felt almost physical. "He has more authorization to be on this ground than either of us ever will, Lieutenant." Then, shifting his attention slightly to address the now silent crowd, the general kept his hand raised in salute and began to speak. His voice was deep, resonant, carrying the weight of decades of experience. "For those of you unfamiliar, let me introduce the man you're looking at. You may see an old man, a civilian, but I see a giant. This is John Miller. To history books, the name may mean little, but to the men of the 5th Special Forces Group, to the first operators of Delta, and to the very man we arrested today, General David Wallace, he is a legend, known in the field by another name, the Shepherd." A collective gasp passed through the crowd. The name was whispered, part of battlefield lore, a ghost story told by veterans. "This man," the general continued, his voice rising with conviction, "ventured into places that don't exist on any map to rescue soldiers the government had written off. He wasn't a soldier in the conventional sense. He was a medic, a pilot, a navigator, and when circumstances demanded, a warrior of unmatched skill. He never held a rank, never accepted a commission and refused every medal offered. His only reward was seeing his men return home safely. The general stepped closer to John, eyes glistening. In the spring of 1968, a helicopter carrying a dozen Green Berets was shot down deep in enemy territory. Among the survivors was a young captain named David Wallace. For 3 days they were surrounded, outnumbered 10-1 with no hope of rescue. On the third night, a single man came for them. Through dense jungle and enemy patrols, he arrived, the shepherd. He carried half of those men to safety on his back. John Miller, right here, is the reason David Wallace lived to become the man we honor today. The general finally lowered his salute, but never broke eye contact with John. Gently, he pointed to the worn pin on John's lapel. You see this piece of metal? The trinket you dismissed as insignificant? The voice dropped into a low, menacing growl aimed directly at the lieutenant. This is a piece of shrapnel from a mortar shell that landed just 3 feet from Captain Wallace. John Miller had thrown himself over Wallace, taking the blast that would have otherwise killed him. David Wallace had later transformed that fragment into a pin, calling it the Medal of Shepherds, the only one ever created. It was the highest honor a man of his character could confer. The recognition was complete and undeniable. The crowd no longer looked with pity. Their gazes were filled with awe. Soldiers of all ranks, from privates to colonels, began, slowly and deliberately, to raise their hands in salute to the humble old man. The lieutenant's face went pale, as though the weight of what he had done physically affected him. He and his guards had not simply erred, they had committed a profound offense. General Peters finally focused fully on the lieutenant and his 2 guards. His voice sank to a quiet, deadly tone, more intimidating than his usual parade ground roar. You asked him for his invitation, he said, each word measured and precise. Let me make this perfectly clear. Every headstone on that hill is his invitation. Every flag flying at half-mast is his personal welcome. He stepped forward, and they instinctively recoiled as if a hand had been raised. You demanded to see his medals. Lieutenant, the scars on this man's body are proof of a courage no rulebook could ever measure. He carries his valor in his heart, not pinned to his chest. Your role is security. But your most essential tools are judgment and discernment, and in that you have failed. The scale of your misunderstanding was staggering. You stood in the presence of living history and saw only a nuisance. You mistook a titan for a trespasser. The general's gaze was unyielding. You will report to my aide. Give him your names and units. Then be in my office at the Pentagon at 600 tomorrow for a conversation about the true meaning of respect. Understood? Yes, General. The 3 men mumbled together, faces flushed with shame. Just as the general turned to leave, John Miller, who had remained silent throughout, placed a gentle, weathered hand on his arm. Michael, he said quietly, using the general's first name. They were just doing their job the only way they knew. Let it be. The general's stern expression softened as he looked down at John. Then he nodded slowly. John then turned to the young lieutenant. There was no anger in his gaze, only quiet, profound wisdom. Son, John said kindly, that uniform doesn't automatically earn you respect. It's a symbol, a promise. Respect is earned every day by how you treat others. And remember, the people who've sacrificed the most often wear no uniform at all. Just remember that. As John spoke, a vivid memory of the pin's origin surfaced. Not chaotic, but clear and poignant. A makeshift field hospital smelling of antiseptic and blood. A young John Miller lay on a cot, his back a canvas of shrapnel wounds. Beside him, Captain David Wallace, his leg in a splint, held a jagged piece of metal ripped from John's body hours earlier. He pressed it into John's hand. They're putting me in for a silver star for this mess, Wallace said, voice heavy with emotion. But it belongs to you, all of it. I don't know what the Army can give you that shows this sacrifice, but I want you to have this, so neither of us forgets the debt. The humble pin symbolized sacrifice in a bond forged in fire and blood. General Peters personally escorted John Miller through the gates, past rows of saluting soldiers and the silent, awed crowd. He led him to the front row, not the back, placing him with General Wallace's grieving family. They embraced the old man, tears in their eyes, grateful for the extra years he had given them with their patriarch. John attended the service, stoic and quiet, paying his respects. His duty finally complete. The fallout from the gate incident was swift but measured. The lieutenant and guards were not dishonorably discharged. John wouldn't have wanted that. Instead, General Peters oversaw their reassignment and retraining, creating a program for security personnel at sensitive installations. The course focused on situational awareness, history, and empathy, teaching soldiers to see the person, not just the uniform. It became known as the Miller Protocol. The story of the old man at the gate turned into a lesson in humility, shared with every new recruit. Months passed. Seasons changed. The now humbled lieutenant worked a quiet checkpoint at a different base, far from Arlington's prestige. On a rainy Tuesday, he stopped for lunch at a small diner off post. Stirring his coffee, the bell above the door jingled. An old man in a simple jacket entered, shaking off the rain, and sat at the counter. It was John Miller. The officer's heart pounded. He watched John order a coffee and gaze out the window, lost in thought. For a long moment, the officer froze, torn between shame and gratitude. Finally, he approached the counter, placed a $10 bill next to John's coffee, and spoke, voice thick with emotion. "For the coffee, sir. And for the lesson, thank you." John Miller looked at the young man, truly saw him. Humility had replaced arrogance. He offered a small, knowing smile and a nod. "Stay safe, son," he said quietly. The officer nodded, turned, and left. A silent, respectful understanding remained as John returned to his coffee. John Miller's story reminds us that true heroes don't always wear their greatness visibly. If this story of quiet valor moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more tales of the unsung heroes among us.